The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Amy Siskind on the profound political upheaval under Donald Trump, Robert Borosage on the profound response only progressive Democrats can offer, and Bill Press talks with Travis Waldron of the Huffington Post about teachers' strikes around the country. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Democracy erodes when we don't pay attention. That's the concern of activist and author Amy Siskind, and why she is on a mission to document the signs of Democratic decline under Donald Trump, week by week. And we say hello to Amy Siskind, former Wall Street executive, president of the New Agenda, an organization dedicated to improving the lives of women and girls, and now an author. Her new book is The List, a week-by-week reckoning of Trump's new year. Amy Siskind, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Your new book is a compilation of a daily list you started. I guess you started making this shortly after Donald Trump was elected. It's called The Weekly List. This is how democracy ends. What made you decide to start a list?
Well, in the aftermath of the surprising election, I read a lot about authoritarian regimes and what that would feel like. And I had a sense at the time the election was done and Trump was the named winner that things were not quite right, just from his early statements and the way things were going pretty much from the get-go. And there were three authors in particular that really, their writings really struck me. One was Masha Gessen, one was Sarah Kendzior, who actually wrote the foreword for my book, and the third was Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And the overlying themes of all three were very similar of what we should expect, but it was really Sarah that advised people to write things down, and her advice was more in the realm of, well, remember what things are like today, write things down because you won't believe what's about to happen. And sure enough, she's been very prescient. All their articles were prescient of what's happened to our country. So the first week that I did it was the first full week after he won, so the week of November 19th. I'd gone up to Valkill, which is the home of Eleanor Roosevelt and sort of my place of refuge and inspiration. And it just felt like the world was in chaos, and she's always been a guiding light for me. And so I was thinking to myself, what would Eleanor do? And a big part of what she did in her time was to keep a daily column, to write things down as well. And I read a lot about her view on democracy and the power of we the people, and got home that Saturday, which is the 19th, and wrote the first weekly list, which was 9 items, a very happy, manageable undertaking. And ironically, when you read the book, one of the items in list 1 is him attacking Saturday Night Live. So you see that when they say this man hasn't changed, this man has not changed. He's doing the same things he did in week 1.
And for anybody that has not had an opportunity to read any of the weekly list or the book, that number from 9 grows significantly from week to week to where we are today. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Yes. There is a sentence that jumps out at me on the website, and it says, experts in authoritarianism advise to keep a list of things subtly changing around you so you'll remember. Was that also an inspiration to you?
I now that I read it back and it's on the cover of the book and it was something I wrote on the first list, and it's sort of now in some ways become almost a mission statement. It was what I decided to do based on everything I read at the time. And again, when I started this list on this Saturday after visiting Valkill, there was no grand ambition or plan. I didn't even, I had no vision of doing a book or anything. The book came after finally the people at Bloomsbury said to me, the first 52 weeks are actually a 500-page book. You need to do this. There was no vision or plan other than listening to the experts and writing things down, because I started to really see very quickly as we kind of got into, I think it was around week 4 or week 5, people started to say to me, I've missed a bunch of things this week. And at that point, the lists were maybe 18 items, 20 items, 30 items. Already it started to feel like chaos. So I really recognized early on the importance of writing this down. And obviously the chaos has grown significantly since then.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely it has. That may be the understatement of our entire conversation. Now, to give our listeners a better sense of this, we picked a random day 44, okay? That would be the week of September 17th, 2017. There are no less than 119 items on the list that week. Do you mind going over a few of those big ones for us?
Sure. On Sunday, Trump announced his sixth wave of U.S. attorney nominations. 41 of the 42 were men. Another one, Trump nominated Eric Dryband to lead the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Dryband testified against the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act and represented UNC in banning transgender people from using the bathroom corresponding to their gender identity. And one more, Axios reported that according to an internal memo, the CDC is cracking down on employees' communications with the press. The memo says not to speak to reporters, quote, even for a simple data-related question.
I'm left shaking my head, and to think there are 116 other items from that particular week that could be read aloud. This has got to be exhausting at times. I mean, how much time does this take every day, and how do you go about collecting your information?
So the book we leave off is week 52, and all the lists are, just as a side note, online at theweeklylist.org. But when I started out doing the first list, they were, again, the first 2 weeks are 9 items, and then it jumped to 18 items in the second week. And I thought to myself, oh, my God, this is so long already. When we ended the first year, we were at around the 140. That was as long as the list had gotten. We just reached 158 last week. But the amount of time I've had to devote to the list obviously has grown as the amount of chaos and the amount of not normal things occurring in our country have increased. And you can sort of trace it to the time before he took office. At the time he took office, there were 36 items in the list. And then as he started to staff up the regime, so it wasn't just him, and he did have at that point more power to do things through executive orders, which a lot of that was unwinding everything Obama had done. But he also had all these other hands in the works of basically deconstructing the agencies these people were meant to run, and or taking away protections and regulations that protect our environment, marginalized communities, poor people, women, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, as more hands have gotten involved in doing this, and as the kleptocracy has increased and the irreverency of his acts, for me personally, around the time he took office, it was probably 10 to 20 weeks. I still had my weekends free. I could, on a Saturday, spend 2 or 3 hours and catch up and finish off the list. By the summer, I was last summer up to about 20 hours a week. And by the end of the first year, which is November of 2017, it was up around 30 hours a week. And pretty much my Fridays are completely gone. And, that's in addition to life as it was. I still run an organization. I have a personal life, what's left of it. But I basically spend all night Friday and all day Friday until 12 or 1 getting as caught up as I can, and then a good portion of the day Saturday finishing the list. So it's chewed up and increasingly chews up even more of my life.
Well, gosh, in the president's defense, he is a job creator. Look what he's done for you. You see, you got a new book out of it. Yeah. See, he didn't lie about anything. We're speaking with Amy Siskind. She's president of the New Agenda, and her new book is called The List, a week-by-week reckoning of Trump's new year. History, of course, is replete with stories of authoritarian governments, and there is often a sense that it can't happen here. Do you see parallels between Germany in the 30s or Venezuela today and what's happening in the U.S.?
The thing that has surprised me the most as I started to do the list, and it started to become pretty clear to me early on that we were in serious trouble. And the people that were calling this out early on, we were viewed as hysterical or whatnot. It wasn't widely believed that he would be anything other than a regular Republican president. That took about half a year for people to start to understand. But early on, I would say that I was unsure how things would play out, whether the people in our country would be, as Naomi Shulman's poem puts it, the nice people that waved as the parades went down the street and watched their neighbors be taken away, or if our country would basically come together, unite, and resist. And thank goodness the latter has happened. And you can see sort of historical movements both among women and teenagers / high school students that we haven't seen in decades in terms of the involvement, the activism. And these are people, I'm more speaking to women, the teens are new to this as well in several decades. But these are people that were not necessarily politically involved and now are involved. And I don't even necessarily believe it's politics. I think at this point it's a fight for our democracy and our way of life. So I think what you're seeing right now is people are galvanized, they're resisting, and thank God our country, I start to see the path to our ascent back to democracy. And that's really because the people have not gone along with this. They're not going along and throwing in the hat. They're fighting for our country.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, our system has checks and balances that are supposed to put the brakes on authoritarianism. And that's the idea behind the 3 branches of government. Now, we see the kids rising up and that kind of thing. But is that system of the 3 branches of government, is that still working?
Yeah, actually, that's something Sarah Kendzior wrote in the foreword of my book, that we have discovered that a lot more of what we thought would be our safety valves would be our more, it turns out, norms, not law. You can see how things, and I personally thought that we would have more checks and balances. It really hasn't worked out that way. Our executive branch is still roughly a third of the executive positions are unfilled, key roles unfilled. It's especially noteworthy in the State Department, where we basically have no diplomacy. But Trump has gone through great effort and had some large success in deconstructing our agencies and taking away their teeth. You can see that, this week's story with Tillerson not spending $120 million of State Department funds to counter Russia. You can see every week in the list the action with the EPA and Pruitt taking away regulations, cozying up with insiders and lobbyists. So our executive branch is dysfunctional at best, and Trump has consolidated a lot of power in our executive branch. Our legislative branch, I have to say, has been a real disappointment to me personally. I did believe there were early signs in the early weeks of the list with McCain and Graham that there was going to be a fight for our country, and they have turned out to totally lay down and do nothing, even in the face of indictments by Mueller against Russia. Still silence from the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, there's some that are fighting, especially in my observations, our politicians that are people of color are doing more than their share of fighting. But the Democrats could do a much better job as well. There's a lot of complacency, a lot of people, I think, that could be replaced in this, if not this election, the next time. So the legislative branch has been pretty dysfunctional and has done pretty much nothing to stop Trump. I hope springs eternal. I think we're going to see, for sure, the Democrats take back the House and maybe the Senate. And, potentially, I think we could use some new leadership, especially in the Senate, to really have what I call a wartime concierge. That's what we're in now. This isn't a time for diplomacy. This is a time for action. And hopefully we'll see some action then. And that should coincide nicely with what is coming out of the Mueller probe. The thing that has saved us is the judicial branch, in the Muslim ban, with DACA. The list is long. The transgender military ban. All that said, Trump is bringing in his people into the judicial branch, extremists, as I noted in the piece I just read. Predominantly, not even predominantly, 95% white people and 90% men are of his judicial nominees, and they're all extremists. And the first example of his people coming in was when we need to replace the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And the next in line should have been the chief of staff, and instead he brought in Mulvaney, who Trump's judge, this is the first time we've seen one of his judges ruled that Mulvaney could be the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And that's gone exceedingly well because the first thing he did was ask for a budget of $0 to fund the agency. So the judicial branch is holding in now, but he is stacking that quickly. And these are also not normal things in the list. We've taken away some of the checks and balances within the Senate of the process of being able to stop some of the more extremist nominees. We've had a record number that are viewed as not appropriate by the American Bar Association under Trump. So there are all things that are, the longer he's in power, our judicial branch could be in trouble as well. But basically, in short answer is no, it's not functioning the way we hoped it would work.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's also the role of the press to put a check on power. You're a part of that now. Is the press stepping up enough?
I try not to be too hard on the press because I realize they have a job to do. Their job is to cover the news. And I think they've gotten a lot better in the first year plus in the first year, you'd see a lot of, well, give him a chance. And then you saw, he just became president tonight, where he, would make a speech off a teleprompter and not go off and start the lock her up chants. I think the media has come together on that. I think what my list does that the media is not able to do is I track everything. I think and again, it's an occupational hazard. He throws a lot of shiny coins and they chase them. And I try not to, again, be combative with the media because I understand their role is they have to report their news. But you can spend a whole week covering Devin Nunes. And in my list that week, the memo, they were breathlessly watching him. There were 140 items that week. And anything related to his memo were 10 to 20 of the items. So we weren't talking about another 120 items, many of which in normal times would have been headlines for weeks or months. So I feel like that's the service that I'm providing, is sort of a checkoff that on a Sunday morning you can read, oh my God, I missed that. This week, Trump had another bad call with the president of Mexico and canceled another visit to come to the White House. And this week, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico quit. Like, these are stories that are getting no coverage because we're in chaos. The other thing I want to point out that I'm actually going to be speaking on in the ACLU in a couple of weeks is what is slowly happening to our press. There's a lot of press that has changed hands and or consolidated. You have the Koch brothers basically taking control of Time Inc. and all the associated labels of Time. You have Sinclair Broadcasting expanding under the new FCC rules, where they have basically, or they're into 72% of our households, and they do control the content and make sure it's pro-Trump. So you have other examples where you have conservative billionaires who have bought large publications, one in New York, one in LA, and shut them down. So there are a lot of things going on to hurt our media, and I think we all have to, and I personally have done this as well, support our media. Pay for the media for those of us who can afford to. Your local media, the national media, they are doing investigative work and providing a service that is extremely necessary at this point.
Now, before we let you go, what's it mean to you that your list is now a book? Because I know you said earlier you never anticipated this.
Yeah, so funny story, I'm starting around the spring of 2017, I started getting fairly regular emails from publishers, from agents about the book or about the list and turning it into a book. And I gave everybody the same response, which is, I'm just too busy keeping up. When he's gone, reach back out again. And I really just didn't have the time to focus on it or, the desire to turn it into a book. When that changed was, two things. One, when there was talk about net neutrality and the concept of information disappearing. As a side note, the lists the online versions are being archived in the Library of Congress, so that gave me some hope. But the idea that people that access to written material could disappear for a lot of people who don't have the money for it, that was sort of an impetus. And then again, an editor at Bloomsbury who had been writing to me from the spring of 2017 finally wrote to me in a very concrete way and said, this is now, we put it into a format of a book. It's a 400-page book already, your first 52 weeks. And wow. I think it was just a confluence of those factors that I said to them, I don't have a lot of time. And it turned out, it does take a lot of time to do a book. And this book is being received much more widely. And than I think any of us had anticipated. So it's a 400-page book and 100 pages of triple-spaced footnotes with abbreviations. So in many ways, it's antithetical to Michael Wolff's book because everything in here is factual, and I have already seen some advanced copies, people using it for their own books as a way to cite history because everything you can trace back in the table of contents, which is kind of a bizarre table of contents with some of the items because this has been a really strange time for our country. Yeah. But yes, it's a 500-plus page book, even as we get, the first full year of him from the time he was elected. And there's the I'm glad that I did it in retrospect.
And there's the possibility you have 3 sequels, although that could be less. We'll have to see.
Oh, please. Yeah, I don't believe he's going to last that long. I don't believe he's going to make it his full term. And if he does, as people are half joking, who knows if there'll be books by then. But I'm going to keep going until he's gone. That's the plan.
Very good. Well, it's good stuff. Amy Siskind, again, former Wall Street executive, president of The New Agenda. Her new book is The List, a week-by-week reckoning of Trump's new year. And, of course, you can always visit the website as well to keep up to date on things, theweeklylist.org. Amy, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do appreciate it and hope we can have you back again soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
You're quite welcome. Take care. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care. This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the progressive agenda that Democrats need to win back the nation this November. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Greed is good, proclaimed Gordon Gekko, lead character in a 1987 film lampooning the low ethics of the high-finance barons of Wall Street. You might think that surely this Hollywood portrayal is a gross exaggeration, but check out an egregious example of Gekko-level greed being pushed by today's Wall Street sharks. Big-shot financiers have been going all out to kill a sensible Labor Department rule meant to protect people's retirement accounts from the self-serving guile of financial manipulators. The rule simply requires firms that manage these accounts to put our money in investments expected to produce the best returns for us, rather than in investments that pay the highest interest fees to them. It's hardly harsh to require them to treat us common customers with basic honesty, applying what amounts to a golden rule for bankers. But, howls of outrage exploded from the Wall Street baronies. Lobbyists swarmed into Washington, and scores of lawyers rushed into courts. To defend their right to be dishonest, the greed-fueled bankers resorted to more dishonesty, claiming that the fiduciary rule would hurt, quote, smaller investors. Huh? Well, they prevaricated, only by misdirecting small retirement savers into high-fee investments can we make enough profit to give, quote, affordable financial advice to workaday folks. Again, huh? These banks are wallowing in unconscionable levels of profits, but the only affordable advice they want to offer us is bad advice, funneling our retirement stash into deals that benefit them at our expense. This is Jim Hightower saying bankers claiming that they have a legal right to profit by cheating their own customers is a level of gluttony so gross that it would even gag Gordon Gekko. For more information, go to consumerfed.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In the wake of Conor Lamb's victory in Pennsylvania, progressive activist Robert Borosage says that the signs are clear. Americans are ready for change, and progressive Democrats have the solution. And we say hello to Robert Borosage, founder and president of the Institute for America's Future and co-director of its sister organization, the Campaign for America's Future. He's also a contributing editor to The Nation magazine. Robert Borosage, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure.
And our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with Conor Lamb's victory in the Pennsylvania 18th House District. You recently wrote an article in The Nation titled, "Progressives have the right plan to win in November." The first things you do is debunk some myths, one of them being the idea promoted by conservatives that attributes Lamb's win to his embrace of conservative ideas. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I thought that was sort of a wonderful line that came out of the Republican Party as they tried to explain why they lost a district that Trump had won by 20 points. And the argument was that, well, he just ran masked as a Republican. But the reality is that Lamb campaigned really as a strong Democrat and a strong liberal. He was for universal health care, for taking on the drug companies, against Trump's tax cut, for expanded background checks on gun sales, for stronger unions, against cuts to Social Security. And he made the centerpiece of his campaign an assault on the Republican tax cuts and the attempt then to go after deep cuts in Social Security and Medicare thereafter. And so he didn't run as a Republican that I know of. Any Republican I know of, he ran as a progressive.
Yeah,
certainly on kitchen table issues.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very Republican at all. Another theory put forth by some Democrats is that Lamb validated the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee's strategy of finding candidates that, quote unquote, fit the district. What does it mean, and what's wrong with that way of thinking?
Well, there's two ways to define fitting your districts. One is that we want candidates who've done a lot of work in the district, have been involved in public service, have made a commitment and shown where their values are. And that definition I agree with totally. Too often, though, the DCCC defines the strategy of fit their districts as a code for recruiting more conservative or more corporate Democrats, largely Democrats who either can fund their own campaigns or who are in the world that allows them easily to raise a lot of money, as opposed to people who will carry a progressive message into the district. And the problem with that strategy is that it often disarms Democrats in any ability to appeal to working families, working people in those districts, because it means that the Democratic candidate does not have a strong set of progressive economics around kitchen table issues, and instead tends to lead with social issues that often are more divisive among working class voters. And that, I think, has been historically a mistake for Democrats, and one that we've got to get over. And Connor Lamb illustrates that in a district that was had both suburban and upper middle class voters and significant white working class and base of voters. He put together a campaign on really founded on progressive kitchen table issues, with a very populist edge around the tax cuts. He said that he wouldn't vote for Pelosi to be speaker to take that issue off the table. He said he was personally anti-abortion, but opposed any restrictions on abortion in law. He said he was a gun owner and did an ad with him showing how he knew how to put together a gun, but he was for universal background checks. So he was able to defend the social liberalism that is central to the party, while grounding his campaign on an appeal to working people. And his entire field operation came out of the unions. He was a staunch supporter of unions against a Republican who said he was Trump before Trump was Trump, and was championing the right to work, which basically destroys unions. And so I think he gives us a good clue about how to go forward in these elections.
So are the lessons of Connor Lamb's campaign and success up to this point, is that the blueprint for success for Democrats across the country?
It's certainly part of the national blueprint. These elections, in theory, all elections are local, but in fact, more and more of them, even the by-elections, become nationalized. And this election, given Trump, is going to be very nationalized. The mobilizations of young people, of women, of people of color, of Latinos and others are going on at a national level and are fueling energy across districts. And at the same time, you've got this phenomenon where you have an economy that really has not worked for most Americans. And people are looking for real answers. And Democrats have to speak to that. They have to be agents of change and talking about those kitchen table issues. And I think the Connor Lamb campaign was a good version of that. there will be different versions, but that theme, I think, is central.
Mm-hmm. Now, in that same Nation article, as well as in others, you write about the Progressive Caucus Center Strategy Summit and the potential it has to push the so-called blue wave. You are, I should mention, chair of the Progressive Caucus Center, but tell us about the organization.
Well, the organization is a support group to the Congressional Progressive Caucus. The caucus is the largest and most diverse caucus in the Democratic Party in the House. Its members tend to come from strong Democratic districts, and they have been increasingly united around a very bold populist agenda. Fair trade, $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, expand Social Security, tuition-free college, ardent support for workers' rights and unions, support for a massive public investment to rebuild the country and move towards a jobs guarantee. And they have both increasing weight in the Democratic caucus and I think increasing traction across the country. And they are, I think, driving the kind of progressive agenda that Democrats have to come to if we are going to actually make this country work for working people again and rebuild a strong middle class. And so I think that what's interesting about this moment is, on the one hand, you've got these remarkable mobilizations that have come in reaction to Trump among women, among African Americans, among young people, among the DACA kids and Latinos, and on the other hand, and at the same time, you've got increasing push by progressives for a much bolder economic agenda that speaks to the basic struggles and concerns of working people. And I think that combination is going to be very powerful in the fall if it gets put together.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Robert Borosage, founder and president of the Institute for America's Future and co-director of its sister organization, the Campaign for America's Future. He's also contributing editor to The Nation magazine. You've written that progressive reforms are not only necessary but popular. How do we know that?
Well, I think you can see it in poll after poll that progressive reforms have majority support. I think people are sort of surprised when they actually see polling on issues, whether it's Medicare for all or a large increase in the minimum wage or tuition-free college or taking on the drug companies or opposition to tax cuts for the rich and the corporations. All those have vast majority support in polling. And you've got to be able to defend them. You've got to be able to take them on. But I think people are increasingly understanding that the conservative ideas that have dominated our politics over the last decades have been tried and failed. And they are looking for people who will stand up on those. I think Trump benefited dramatically in 2016 because he could paint himself he tried to paint himself as a populist agent of change who would take on our failed trade policies and clean out the swamp and get rid of reduce the corrupted politics in Washington. Now, it turns out those were largely fake promises, but they were they spoke to people who were looking for somebody who would make a change that would work for them.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, for right now, those were, they're very short-lived campaign promises, and does that come back and bite them in November? One can only hope. You've also written that the more mainstream Democrats, such as the DCC, in your words, remain wedded to the old ways of doing business. What would they have to do to show you they're open to change?
Well, I think there's two things. One is you've got to make the party much more open to and supportive of ardent progressive candidates, particularly those who are laying out a bold economic agenda. And that means for the DCCC really not putting their thumb in the scale on primaries where they are pushing for kind of corporate Democrats, helping them raise money, trying to shove others out of the race, and just let the voters decide in the primaries who they want to champion them in the general. And then the second thing is, one of the problems that any political candidate has now, I believe, is credibility. Most people are increasingly cynical about politicians, and they're cynical about their promises. They understand how corrupt the system is by big money, and they see their legislators too often as in the pockets of their donors. And I think every candidate has to find a way to prove that they are credible, that what they are saying to people they actually believe. Now, there are different ways to do that. Sanders did it in 2016 because he had been saying the same thing for decades and because he was funding his campaign with small donations. Trump gained a bit of it, I would say, even though he was one of the most distrusted candidates ever and unpopular candidates ever, by arguing he was self-funding. And so he could rail against the corrupted politicians he was running against, even in the Republican primary. Elizabeth Warren does it by connecting her biography, growing up on what she calls the ragged edge of the middle class and the struggles of her family when she was young, with the policies and politics she's now championing. But I think that the DCCC and the kind of establishment of the party is less aware of the need to speak to that and to speak to the corrupting effects of money on politics, because, of course, that's what they do, is money in politics. They are more wedded to the old ways of raising money and discount candidates who are trying to build a volunteer base and greater energy with small donations, and they are sort of biased, obviously, to candidates who can self-fund and or raise big money from deep pockets. And I think we've got to. It's important for the party to allow this progressive energy that has started to find its way electorally. The other thing I think the DCCC and the party pros do is they are very, skeptical of the importance of passion. And in by-elections particularly, which are low turnout elections, the passionate arousal of your own base makes a huge difference. And that can be done in reaction to Trump. We see the kind of passion building among Democrats and the kinds of increased turnout we've had as a result. And it can be done with an agenda that speaks to real people and their needs and gets them excited about being able to make a change. But we've got to be aware of and supportive of building the passion, not trying to find centrist candidates who, in theory, can appeal to a small number of mythical swing voters.
And again, I think you go back and you look at Connor Lamb, right? I mean, that's if you emulate what he has done up to this point, perhaps November's an easy ride for Democrats.
Nothing. We're a long way away from November. Who knows what happens between now and November?
I can dream.
Trump has just made he's made a terrifying appointment into the National Security Council. Somebody who really does want war with North Korea and with Iran. And if we're in a war, it changes the entire political spectrum. If the economy tanks, it will change the spectrum. If it continues to grow and unemployment continues and more people continue to get employed, then that'll have an effect too. So I think we're a long way from November. What we do see is there's real energy on our side, and there's kind of disillusion and dismay on their side, and that's a very good thing now. And we have to have a process that allows candidates that are capturing that energy to rise into the electoral process.
And now, before we let you go, I want to kind of change it around a little bit. I want to ask you about Donald Trump's recent appointment of John Bolton, National Security Advisor. What does this say to you about the Trump administration's national security agenda?
Well, it's very frightening. First of all, it is the ultimate betrayal. This is a guy who ran on his skepticism of our endless wars in the Middle East without victory, claimed he was an opponent of the Iraq invasion, said he would get us out of Afghanistan, and now has increased the troops in Afghanistan, in Syria, increased the drone bombings, and now he brings Bolton in. Bolton is not simply a hawk. Bolton is an unrepentant, really warmonger, and I use those words carefully, not as he really has never, he's been a strong advocate of all of our most failed wars. He, to this day, is an advocate of the invasion of Iraq, which is surely the biggest debacle since Vietnam. And he has called on administrations to bomb North Korea, not to negotiate with them, and to rip up the Iran deal on nuclear weapons and bomb Iran. And, you know, where he comes into office as Trump is flailing around in the polls, is increasingly beleaguered, even though the economy is good, we head towards the May deadline where Trump has to decide whether he keeps the Iran nuclear deal going or whether he rips it up. And Bolton surely at his ear will be arguing for him to get out of the deal, as will Pompeo, who he's just made Secretary of State, or is nominated for Secretary of State. And if the deal is ripped up, then I think the likelihood of a catastrophic war with an attack on Iran is very great. So this is a really ominous appointment at a truly ominous time.
Mm-hmm. Now, close to a year ago, you wrote about the need for progressives to have a more defined national security vision. Do you see that emerging?
Not much. Sadly, I think we've seen stirrings. There was a good effort to try to get the United States to stop supporting the Saudi humanitarian disaster in Yemen. And that got 40 votes in the Senate, and that was driven by Democrats. Bernie Sanders did a speech that tried to lay out a challenge to the kind of notion that we could police the world and discuss the neglected security priorities from climate change to massive inequality. But I think there's been remarkably little movement and energy on the foreign policy questions, and that's something we still have to solve and address.
Okay. Robert Borosage, founder and president of the Institute for America's Future, co-director of its sister organization, the Campaign for America's Future, and, of course, contributing editor to The Nation magazine, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Robert, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
It's my pleasure. Good to talk to you.
You as well. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Travis Waldron of the Huffington Post about the newfound political force of teachers.
Oh, BFD, the Braves beat the Nats. You know, well,
only one game back.
The Nats can't win every game. Hey, what do you say, everybody? Great to see you today. It is on a Wednesday. It's a Wednesday, April 4. How about it? The Bill Press Show booming out to you nationwide, indeed. From our studio on Capitol Hill, Eugene Scott from the Washington Post, here as a friend of Bill for the entire hour, and we're joined fresh back from his home state of Kentucky, where he's down there with a big teacher strike, Travis Waldron from Huff Post. Hello, Travis. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Before we jump back into it, just a little bit of breaking news. I just got on my phone during the break that the crowds are already lining up in Darien, Illinois, in front of the Frugal Muse bookstore. Because I'm going to be there tonight.
Nice.
There it is. So you better get out and get in line if you want a spot in the Frugal Muse bookstore in Darien, Illinois, 6:30 tonight. Big town hall. We're going to talk about Illinois politics, national politics, whatever you want to talk about, how bad Donald Trump really is. And, of course, we'll take a little look at my new book, From the Left, Life in the Crossfire. Find more about it on our website at BillPressShow.com. But come on out tonight if you're anywhere in the Chicago area. The great suburb of Darien. We'll be there at 6:30, Frugal Muse Bookstore. And we'll see you then. Too bad. You guys want to go?
You paying?
Always. Why not? Chicago.
Yeah, right. Come on.
Go.
I'm hopping on the plane right after the program here. So, Travis, Kentucky and Oklahoma, in the wake of West Virginia, tell us what it was like down there.
It was crazy. It was, I think, between 5,000 and 10,000 protesters outside the Capitol in Frankfort on Monday morning.
And what are they asking?
Well, it's a little bit different than West Virginia and Oklahoma, where a lot of it's about compensation. In Kentucky, it's about pensions, first and foremost. On Thursday night, the Kentucky state legislature kind of inserted pension reforms into a public sewage bill, what had previously been a public sewage bill. Passed it just a few hours later. The pension fight's been going on for a long time. Kentucky's public pensions are some of the worst funded in the nation. And Matt Bevin, the Republican governor, and the Republican state legislature has been trying to pass reforms, most of them opposed by teachers. A lot of them the teachers say are illegal, unconstitutional under Kentucky law because they have a contract and a stipulation in the Kentucky Constitution that says that contract can't just be amended for current teachers. They got most of what they were asking for in the short term. The current teachers don't lose many benefits. A lot of what they called the worst parts are out of this bill, but it switches new hires to more of a 401k system and caps some other benefits and changes some things. And so they're pretty upset.
Are they did they walk out of the classrooms?
They walked out, on Friday morning. So a lot of Kentucky was already on spring break. And Friday morning, they had a sick out, is what they called it. Teachers just called in sick en masse. And I think 26 counties closed schools, including Jefferson County, which is Louisville, and Fayette County, which is Lexington. So the two biggest districts in the state. And then on Monday, I think roughly 90 or so of the counties were on spring break, 90 of the 120 Kentucky counties. The others all closed. So the teachers, there were teachers, I believe, from every county in Kentucky at the rally on Monday morning.
Is it ongoing?
It's sort of lapsed. The legislative session is on break now for 10 days. And with it being spring break, they're kind of waiting and seeing how what Bevin does with the pension bill. There were potential budget cuts that they were protesting. The budget bill, they actually got some wins in, but Bevin has the ability to line item veto and has already sort of indicated that he might veto some of the funding that the legislature put back in that teachers wanted. So they're kind of in a wait and see approach right now. They go back in, I believe, on the 13th. And that's when Bevin will have a window to start vetoing things. So if I talked to an organizer and a teacher last night, and they basically said we're just sort of waiting to see what happens.
Meanwhile, also in Oklahoma, I think the very first day, the 36,000 teachers walked off the jobs, walked and stormed. They really took over the state capitol, as they did in Kentucky. Right. They took over the state capitol. There was another big rally out in Oklahoma yesterday. Here, Peter, the chant of the teachers in Oklahoma: "Invest in the future."
Invest in the best.
In the best, that's right.
Which is the future.
Which is the future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then Mary Fallon, the governor of Oklahoma, just listen to this. This is you talk about being clueless or out of step. The wrong message. Here's what she envisions for teachers to be able to do their job and support their family.
No, I hope we could get to the salary to where they could work one or if they choose, they got a big family, 2 jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She wants to get to the point where teachers can get by working 2 jobs. Yeah. Gene?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's another window into the conversation about the classes that voted for Donald Trump. We talk a lot about working class voters, and specifically the white working class that voted for Donald Trump. The reality is teachers are college-educated professionals still dealing with a lot of working class challenges. And I think it reminds us that it's not just these low-income individuals that don't have college degrees that are struggling, trying to figure out what it means to attain the American dream. It's many people with graduate degrees.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point because in Kentucky, I think the teachers have become kind of a symbol of broader working class and especially public state workers because the other state workers are dealing with these pension changes too. So there were police and firefighters unions and Teamsters unions and, Matt Bevin in Kentucky, his first act last year in 2017 was to pass right-to-work legislation and repeal Kentucky's prevailing wage law. So there was a lot of discussion about that at this protest. It was kind of the teachers have become the most potent symbol in a lot of these places. But I think the argument is more about what is it, why can't we make a living in these states anymore? And even beyond that, I mean, there's questions that go to that too about the broader what they see as dismantling of public education systems across the country. Yeah,
have Mary Fallon drive a taxi cab at night to keep her to feed her family. I mean, that idea that she sees that as a goal, as long as they're only working 2 jobs, so then everything is okay. Now, I didn't have a chance to double check this, but I saw on CBS the other night in Oklahoma that it takes 20 years as a teacher to build under existing system to get up to where you're earning $40,000 a year.
Wow.
I mean, it's just criminal.
But it's believable. I mean, based on what we have seen in terms of salaries nationally, when you think of how low the pay is in some more prosperous communities, it would only make sense that Oklahoma would be even more challenged.
They're 49 among 50 states.
Wow.
I don't know who number 50 is.
Yeah, and you made
probably
the point,
Mississippi.
Yeah, you made the point about graduate degrees. In Kentucky, if you're a public school teacher, you're required to get a master's degree. While you're teaching. You don't have to have it to start, but eventually you have to have a master's degree, and that's out of pocket for most of the teachers. And so, and also when it comes back to the pensions, Kentucky teachers aren't eligible for Social Security. So their pension is their only retirement. I mean, this is a point they stressed over and over and over again, is that if they're
not eligible for Social Security?
But Ray and I both, our jaws just hit the floor.
Yeah.
Really?
Right. No. Right. I think there's 13 states where teachers as part of their pension programs aren't eligible for Social Security.
Oh, my God.
And so they give 13% of their paycheck to their retirement and health care plans for retirement. And if they don't have Social Security or if these pensions are reduced or they go away, that's not necessarily as big of a problem for current teachers because the pension isn't changing that much for them. But for future teachers that are on a 401k plan with no Social Security to back that up, they're saying the big thing here is we're not going to be able to recruit teachers. In a state where, God bless it, it's my home and I love it, but the public education system is already among probably the bottom 5 in the country. And if you can't recruit teachers, if they're leaving for Ohio or, any other state, it's only going to get even worse.
Yeah, and in no state, I would argue, are teachers really being paid what they deserve.
Right.
Some of them may be able to make a prevailing wage, but look at Oklahoma. I mean, how you're a young person in Oklahoma, you're dedicated, you really want to make a life helping others by teaching. Why would you go into it if it takes you 20 years to get up to $40,000 a year?
Yeah, I mean, when you were describing what's happening, I couldn't help but to think about like the colleges of education at these universities trying to recruit students to major in education. That has to be incredibly difficult at this point. to encourage people that.
And on top of that, as so many of these teachers have pointed out, remember we had a clip yesterday from a teacher saying in her school the kids have to carry their chairs from one classroom to the next because there are not enough chairs. Textbooks with duct tape holding them together year after year.
So
after
if you don't have textbooks and chairs, should teachers get guns as well now?
Of course. By the way, out of their own pocket, they have to pay for their guns.
I talked to a teacher in Kentucky yesterday in Louisville, which is one of the probably better funded districts in the state.
Yeah.
And he said his school, his business class that he teaches, they haven't gotten new textbooks since 2008. And so he basically doesn't use textbooks anymore. Because,
you're obviously not talking about the economic downturn.
Right.
That's insane.
Right. How do you teach American business in 2018 with a 2008 textbook?
You miss a lot.
This I think is a point for Democrats to point to in these elections, because I don't think that the Democrats have done a very good job of taking care of unions and labor and the workforce over the years. They've just sort of taken it for granted that a lot of them are going to vote Democratically, and they haven't spoken to those needs. And when you have a place like Kentucky or Oklahoma or West Virginia, which are red states, and you're seeing these uprisings from teachers, the point here is, no, they can't pay the teachers because they've given so many tax cuts to big businesses, oil companies, coal companies in West Virginia. And, this is the argument.
They give it away, and then we say we don't have money to pay you what you
Kentucky's
deserve.
an interesting point on that, Peter, because
They create the problem.
Kentucky's been a red state for a long time at the federal level, but it was a blue state for, even just now in 2016, they lost the legislature completely to Republicans for the first time in a century.
By the way, so was West Virginia.
Right.
West Virginia was a blue
Matt
state.
Bevin's only the second Republican governor Kentucky's had in my lifetime. So, Democrats in the past, when it comes to the pension shortfalls in Kentucky, some of the budget problems, they've been just as big of a problem on this. And, they're just as responsible for a lot of these problems as the Republicans are. I do think in Kentucky, right now, you have a bunch of teachers running for office, and I think there are a new sort of class of Democrats that are looking at this and saying, something really has to be done. And I think you'd have to be blind, frankly, to look at what happened in Kentucky or even in Oklahoma and West Virginia as the Democratic Party and say, well, we should listen to those people and champion their cause.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Amy Siskind, Robert Borosage, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.